Welcome back. This is our WH4 Age of Discovery lecture. All right. So the Age of Discovery in Europe is where the European powers start to look outward and go beyond Europe. Remember, we talked about the Peace of Westphalia, the agreed upon borders, the idea of modern statehood. Well, now they're going to look to the rest of the world for resources and territory. So we're going to see stimulated trade with markets in Asia, expanding economies of European states. They're going to lose Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And so because of the Ottomans, they're also looking for new sea trade routes for trade with the East. And so they're going to embark for all these reasons and find new sources of wealth. I use the term discover loosely. All the territory that these European powers are going to quote unquote discover and claim are already inhabited and claimed by indigenous peoples. And so one consequence of this globalizing force, this age of discovery, is the subjugation of indigenous peoples, taking their lands, and in some cases, their genocide, their complete eradication, as we'll see, especially in North America and Latin America and the Caribbean. So factors contributing to European discovery of lands in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, there's a high demand for gold and spices and natural resources in Europe. All right. So by exploring overseas, merchants hope to benefit from what they see as profitable business. And so it's really about money, and the icing on the cake is the spread of Christianity. So you are going to have some folks who are looking to spread Christianity, although number two is more often an excuse to pursue number one. So this was used as a reason to really go and do this. Hey, we're not plundering the other societies. We're not stealing from them and destroying them. We're actually helping them because we're spreading Christianity. All right. So, but I mean, actually what they're doing is wiping these folks out, taking their land and taking their resources for their economic benefit. All right. Number three, political and economic competition. Remember the Peace of Westphalia, right? Well, now if you want to become more powerful and more wealthy, you got to look beyond Europe, beyond those borders, and get colonies. So there's competition for wealth in Asia, right? So they're seeking new trade routes. They're seeking new overseas holdings. Remember I said that Baghdad was a center of scholarship, lots of science and technology that originated in places like China and the Middle East had flowed into Europe, especially celestial navigation and the compass. And so these new tools are going to be used by Europeans to go out and explore the world. Okay. And so they're going to set out, here you can see some early explorations. Okay. The Europeans definitely weren't the first to do this. And so the Chinese, under Admiral Zheng He, sailed out and sailed around India and along the east coast of Africa. And if they had kept going, and they certainly could have, these Chinese treasure fleets were huge, and the ships dwarfed European ships in size. They could have potentially, gone on to explore the rest of the world. China is a different society than Europe. China was very unified, right? Whereas Europe was very fragmented. That seems like a disadvantage. But the Chinese become very suspicious of the merchant class. They find a lot of things in the merchant class counter to Confucian teachings. And so they sort of crack down on merchants, on international trade. They eventually look inward. They didn't really need international trade, by the way. China had everything it needed within its borders and said so. And so they banned ships with more than one mast. They reduced international trade, cracked down on the merchant class, and they look inward. And that is going to put them at a disadvantage. A more fragmented Europe wasn't able to kind of crack down on the merchant class, so to speak, and so merchants were able to become powerful. Trade became more frequent. But the same thing happens in Japan. Japan looks inward. China looks inward. The Ottomans are going to do the same thing. And so that's one of the reasons why you see Europe sort of with more of a burgeoning merchant class. Okay, so why did European nations seek discovery? Discovery. Okay, they're not really discovering anything. One is early explorers. So you've got Prince Henry the Navigator. Let me see if I can use my select tool and move this compass out of the way. There we go, that's better. Okay, so Prince Henry the Navigator, he establishes a school that studied navigation, map making, and shipbuilding. He's from Portugal, right? He hoped to find a new route to the Indies, to the east, to Asia, and he wanted to explore West Africa. All right, so you can see he is hoping to find routes. You know, he's exploring West Africa. He's hoping to find trade routes out into Asian markets. Okay, everything in sub-Saharan Africa was sort of unknown. They didn't really know what was down here. There were all sorts of rumors too. Like there was a myth that there was a European ruler named Prester John who had some sort of European kingdom in sub-Saharan Africa somewhere. So they didn't really know anything about Africa south of the Sahara. They knew more about North Africa because Mediterranean trade links had caused people, through Egypt and other North African countries, they had a chance to become familiar with these areas. And even though North Africa is strongly linked to sub-Saharan Africa via trade routes, there's not a lot of knowledge about sub-Saharan Africa in Europe. Okay. All right. So why are European explorers trying to explore new places? God, gold, glory, the 3 Gs. Yeah, it's an oversimplification, but it's true. They wanted trade routes for gold, spices, and natural resources. They're going to do this in the name of Christianity. All right. In the name of spreading Christianity. And that's going to be used as an excuse for centuries to come. All right, and so there are new ideas, also navigation technology from China, from the Islamic empires. Europeans are going to use Prince Henry is going to help pioneer European exploration. Okay, Christopher Columbus is probably one of the early European explorers you're more familiar with. He wanted to find a new trade route to India. All right. So brave is not really the first word I would use to describe Christopher Columbus. Probably greedy would be more appropriate, and that he certainly was. So he wanted to find a new trade route to India, to find riches. He calculated that the world was actually way smaller than it really was, and after numerous trips to the quote-unquote New World, which it was only new to Europeans. It was the old world. It was home to millions of indigenous people. He was still convinced that to the day he died, that he had found the Indies, that he had found India, and that's why he called the native peoples that he met Indians. All right, so he made landfall in 1492. He met a group of natives called the Taínos. Through subsequent voyages, he returned with more men and material, and basically set about just trying to enslave the local population and force them to bring him gold. And so Columbus saw that they had gold trinkets. There wasn't a lot of gold there, so basically he told the Taínos and Caribs and other groups, the Arawak, that make up the Arawak, to bring him gold. They had to bring a certain amount of gold to him every 2 weeks. If they didn't meet their gold quota every 2 weeks, he would have their hands cut off. So they would die from that. They were forced to mine gold day in and day out. Well, the consequence of this is that the Arawak are completely wiped out by Columbus. Columbus wasn't just cruel to the Arawak, he was cruel to the Spanish. So much so that Columbus was eventually arrested and taken back to Spain in shackles. Our modern understanding, the modern story of Columbus, is complete fiction. He was not the noble explorer that he's made out to be. He was a pretty terrible person. So Columbus's voyage, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria sailed out of a Spanish port in August of 1492. He arrived in the Caribbean, landed in what he thought was India, called the Arawak people that he met there. Taino were a member of the Arawak Indians, proclaimed the island for Spain, and called it San Salvador, which is Spanish for Holy Savior. All right, this is what Columbus said when he first encountered the Arawak. He said, "They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." The Arawak that he met were actually very kind and hospitable people, and would have literally given him anything he asked for, which he recognized and saw that they could take advantage of that kindness. So from the moment he set foot on the ground, Columbus saw the Arawak as people to use, to enslave. He was thirsty for gold, and that's it. All right. And so it wasn't until the 19th century where Columbus was reinvented as this noble explorer. And you can see here the voyages of Columbus, and he eventually focuses on the island of Hispaniola, which today is the island on which you will find the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So Columbus wanted gold. He hopped from island to island to claim land for Spain in hopes of finding gold. Spain's rulers, of course, were thrilled with this. Columbus began as an explorer searching for gold, but became an empire builder, if you will. He settled much of the Caribbean, or created colonies on much of the Caribbean, wiping out the Arawak in his quest for gold. By the way, the reason that, let me see if I have it written down here, I don't think I do. The reason that this is called, not necessarily called America, well, you know, the name America we can trace back to the name of the person who first, you know, sighted land, which was Amerigo Vespucci, and eventually his name appearing on maps supposedly is why it ends up being called America. There's different stories. Funny story though. The first person to sight land was supposed to get a lifetime pension from Spain. And Columbus was not the first person to sight land. Supposedly, another one of his crew was. And so, but Columbus stole the pension. So Columbus was like, no, I saw it first, so I get the pension. So that's Columbus for you. He's just a greedy guy. All right, Ferdinand Magellan, born in 1519. He's from Spain, and he led an exploration that was the first to circumnavigate around the world. He didn't make it all the way around. He died in the Philippines. He wanted to lead a voyage to the Pacific Ocean. They sailed for months around South America, out into the Pacific, made their way to Guam in the Philippines, and he was killed in a conflict there. Of his 250 men, only 18 made it back. But his expedition circumnavigated, so was the first to circle the globe. Okay. So you can see he sets out from Spain. They sail, wait a minute. They set out from Spain. They sail around South America, come back to Spain. Now, keep in mind, Magellan dies here. All right, he doesn't make it all the way through. All right, Hernan Cortez, 1519, from Spain. This is when he landed in Mexico. Spain had already colonized much of the Caribbean, so now they're looking at the mainland. They're the first settlers in the Americas. So the oldest city in North America is St. Augustine, Florida. That is a Spanish settlement. They also walked across Texas very early on in the 1500s. And in fact, the Alamo was a Spanish mission created by the Spanish in the 1500s to convert the local Native American population to Catholicism. They enriched their empire greatly, but that money ends up being their downfall. Through all this empire building, they end up causing more trouble for themselves than good, and Spain is eventually going to be a rotting husk of an empire. Okay, so Cortez and Spanish explorers ceased to become exploradors and became conquistadors, and their goal was to conquer, and conquer they did, and they were looking for gold. Cortez heard through the grapevine that the Aztecs had a lot of gold. This is true. Lots of gold and silver in South America. Cortez marches on the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. And because things like horses and the armor were very unfamiliar, Montezuma II mistook Cortez for a god that was was a big part of their religion. So Montezuma gave Cortez gold. Cortez, of course, wasn't satisfied. He was there to conquer and take it all for himself. So in 1520, Cortez and his men kill many Aztec warriors and chiefs. The Aztec drive away the Spanish. But in 1521, Cortez comes back, and with the help of, remember I told you guys that the Aztec had a lot of enemies, so Cortez is able to ally with other groups and come back and conquer the Aztecs. He also had the help of diseases. By the way, it's a popular misconception that all of Cortez's men were armored, mainly because of paintings like this. Really only Cortez and a handful of the leaders were armored. A lot of it was artillery, modern artillery, and gunpowder weapons, but also diseases that allowed him to conquer the Aztecs. All right, so how were they able to contact this large civilization? They had superior weaponry, gunpowder weapons, which helped them. They also had the help of other groups who were enemies of the Aztecs, and then diseases, old world diseases that they're sometimes called, like measles, mumps, smallpox, malaria. These were things that the Native Americans had not been exposed to. All right. And so this brings up a couple of important points, and I'll take a minute and sort of talk about this. When you look at some advantages that Europeans and some civilizations had over large advanced civilizations like the Aztecs, you can really boil it down to a handful of things. High yield grain crops and useful domesticatable animals. And there's a geographer named Jared Diamond that's written a really good book about this called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Why were some civilizations able to develop advanced weaponry? And Diamond says that because they had high yield grain crops like corn, like wheat, they were able to feed large populations with less effort than civilizations that depended on root crops. And so they were able to specialize in other things. So because everybody didn't have to farm, they were able to focus on developing other technologies. They're able to focus on improving military technology and various maths and sciences, okay, and develop these technologies. So even though the Aztec were a very advanced, very large civilization with cities that rivaled their contemporaries in Europe, their ability to support a large sedentary civilization with high yield grain agriculture wasn't as significant. But more importantly, in this case, domesticatable animals, useful domesticatable animals. There's only a handful. Out of all of the species on the earth, there's only a handful of useful domesticatable animals. And among those, only really 5 cows, pigs, goats, sheep, and horses are really, truly useful. And all of those only exist around the Mediterranean world and Europe. In all of the biodiversity of Africa, there were no useful domesticatable animals beyond the guinea fowl, a bird. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, there's elephants, right? Elephants take a lifetime to train, and they're so intelligent that they're still unpredictable and dangerous. And you might think, well, the zebra is a horse. Zebras are not domesticatable. They look like horses, but they spent their entire existence evolving around large predatory animals. So they're nervous and flighty. You cannot use a zebra like a horse. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the only domesticatable animal was the llama. And obviously think about all of the things that horses and cows and pigs and goats and sheep afford. Clothing. They can pull a plow so you can harvest. You can plant and harvest large amounts of crops. You can ride a horse into battle. You can do all sorts. You can make leather. You can do all sorts of things with these animals, right? And then there's one other aspect of domesticatable animals that's really important. All of the really devastating diseases that have plagued man originally came from, so like smallpox came from pigs, right? So by living in close proximity to these domesticatable animals, people in Europe and the Middle East and parts of Africa had been exposed to these diseases and built resistances to them over time. Not so for Native Americans. So when they first encountered these diseases, they were wiped out. Something like 50 to 100 million people were living here before Columbus. 95% of them are going to be eradicated by these diseases in just a few generations. Pizarro wanted to conquer the Inca. He attacked the Incan ruler Atahualpa and his unarmed troops. All right. The Spanish troops crushed the Incans. They kidnapped Atahualpa, and Atahualpa said that he would fill a room with gold for his ransom. He did. It was one of the largest ransoms ever paid by a ruler. They killed him anyway. They ended up giving him the option to either be burned at the stake, or they said that he could be strangled with a garrote. He chose the garrote because he wanted his body to be preserved for mummification. The Spanish took the Incan capital in 1533. All right, you can see Atahualpa with here's a jaguar hide. They're pulling him down. He is going to end up being executed by Pizarro. The Aztec, Maya, and Inca empires were conquered by Spanish conquistadors, and the Spanish built an American empire. They wiped out the natives, oppressed them, imposed their beliefs. They destroyed their civilizations, and will ultimately attempt to enslave those remaining. All right, so you can see here's the Spanish Empire, Spain in 1700. You can see there's some English holdings. England sort of late in the game. The Netherlands, France, and Denmark. Okay. Here is, you can see this is all Portuguese. And in Brazil today, they speak Portuguese. They're not Spanish speaking. All right. Well, they speak Spanish too, but Portuguese is their principal language. Vasco da Gama is a Portuguese explorer who wanted a new route to India. So his voyage of over 27,000 miles gave Portugal a direct route to India, rounded the tip of Africa, and continued east. He reached Calicut in India, discovered new spices, rare silks, and precious gems, and made a killing. His cargo was worth 60 times the cost of the voyage. So of course, anybody hearing this is going to be inspired to do the same thing. And we're going to get a brisk East Indian trade. All right, you can see this is Da Gama's route down around the Horn of Africa, right, back out to Calicut, to India. And this is going to become a very frequent trade route for many, many European traders. Okay. Oh, and they're going to establish important coastal stations here in South Africa and Cape Verde, okay, off the coast of West Africa. And you might wonder, why aren't there more ports? Why aren't there more European ports on the Guinea coast, or on the West African coast, or on the western coast of sub-Saharan Africa? Africa does not have a lot of natural harbors. Okay, much of Africa is like a plateau, and there are very steep cliffs called escarpments that are very close to the African shoreline. So there are not a lot of good natural harbors. South Africa's got one, the Cape Verde Islands have some good ones, but much of this coastline you're not going to find natural harbors. All right, Spain and Portugal are going to fight for land. Okay, let me see if I can clear this up a little bit for you guys, because it's not really. There we go. That's a little bit better, right? All right. So Pope Alexander VI is going to step in to kind of keep the peace. He introduces the line of demarcation, which draws an imaginary line in the Atlantic Ocean from north to south. All lands west of the line of demarcation belong to Spain. All lands east of the line of demarcation belong to Portugal. All right, let's take a look at the map. Here's the line of demarcation. And I know what you're thinking, but what about Brazil? Isn't that Portuguese? This is the line of demarcation in 1493. The line is going to move after the Treaty of Tordesillas, which moves the line of demarcation farther west to include modern parts of Brazil for the Portuguese. Original line of demarcation, 1494, under the Treaty of Tordesillas, it moves west to 46 degrees, 37 minutes west. In 1494, we measure lines of longitude and latitude in degrees, minutes, and a smaller unit of measurement is seconds. So, like a degree is a larger unit of measurement in lines of longitude and latitude, and then in between that are minutes, and in between those are seconds. So you don't have to know that for this course, and just explaining what this means. So there you go. Where did we get the name the Americans? Vespucci. He was an Italian. He worked for Portugal. He traveled along the eastern coast of America, claimed the land was not part of Asia but a new world. His name was on the maps. He was not the first to sight land. That was somebody on Columbus's voyage. Remember I told you Columbus claimed a pension, but his name shows up on a lot of maps, so people start calling it America. All right. Vespucci's voyages, 1499. Okay, 1501 to 1502. There you go. Cool stuff. After hearing about Spain's success, other European nations went in on the game. France and England begin to explore and claim land too. England is way late in the game. They're a backwater at this point. 1534, France reaches the Gulf of Canada. All right, with a large river that they'll name the St. Lawrence River. They follow the St. Lawrence until they reach an island, Mount Royal, that will later be known as Montreal. So this is Jacques Cartier that is doing all of this exploring. Okay, Jacques Cartier's voyages, right? Look, all right, let's look at his 1534 trip. Okay, so he comes in, Prince Edward Island, right? Finds the bay here, Gulf of St. Lawrence, heads back to France, right? Look at this one. All right, he's coming out. He's going to discover, go inland, up the St. Lawrence River. There's Montreal, right? So the French are exploring Canada, and really the kind of whole Midwestern portion of North America is going to belong to the French until 1803, when Napoleon sells it to Thomas Jefferson for $15 million. Works out to about 3 cents of an acre. It's a pretty good deal. All right. De Champlain is a French explorer who in 1608 founds Quebec, which is going to be the base of France's colonial empire. They're also going to claim the lower Mississippi, like I said, and they're going to name it Louisiana after Louis in honor of the French king. New France is part of modern-day Canada. And look at this. This is all France, ooh, sloppy, by the 1700s. Eventually we'll purchase this. Okay, but for now it's French. And then we're going to have the British are going to have all kinds of conflict with the French. We'll talk about the French and Indian War later, right? That ends in 1763. But eventually the British will come to control these lands. Okay, Francis Drake is famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to. He's the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. He is also famous for attacking and seizing Spanish ships. All right, so Drake is basically a pirate. He's a pirate. He's one of the most famous pirates that ever lived, one of the most famous commerce raiders that ever lived. He is just known for showing up out of nowhere, wreaking havoc on the Spanish, and then disappearing back out into the ocean. And they just can't pin him down. One of his, for example, like he raided the well-protected Spanish fort of Cadiz, burned like 37 Spanish ships at anchor, and made off with a ton of barrel staves. These are like the planks of wood used to make barrels. Something like enough barrel staves to make like 60,000 provisions. And I know what you're thinking, so what? Who cares? It's just barrels. So barrel wood had to be aged for it to be good. And so one of the things that's going to plague the Spanish Armada down the road are bad provisions, and that's because they had to use new kind of green wood for barrel staves because Drake got all their barrel staves. So Drake is a very famous English explorer and privateer, and some might have called him a pirate. Here it is broken down. All right, look at all this. Is all Spanish territory. They've got a lot of the really good stuff. French territory. All right, or excuse me, British territory. French territory. Some more English territory right here, hugging the edge of North America. And you can see the Dutch are involved to a lesser degree. And you've got the Russians up here. Okay, the Portuguese, and what's going to become Brazil later on. All right, God, gold, and glory. They wanted to spread Christianity to the New World. Explorers established empires. Remember, one motivation was to spread Christianity. This is the Alamo, and it was a Spanish mission built in the 16th century to convert the local Native American population to Catholicism. And today, they are finding thousands of Native American burial sites around this thing from all of the local Catholic Native Americans that were buried on the mission grounds. Later on, it'll become the site of the famous last stand of the Texans against the Army of Santa Anna. We'll talk about that later. How did the expansion of European empires in the Americas affect religion? Colonists migrated there in search of new lands and religious freedom, and they brought their religion with them. Catholics and Protestants carried faith, language, and culture to new lands and influenced beliefs, and they converted indigenous peoples. Colonists and missionaries converted Native Americans to Christianity, so there's a cultural exchange that's taking place. All right, Europeans migrated to the Americas. They exchanged culture and ideas with Native Americans and Africans. So they are acting on each other. This is not a one-way thing. Europeans are going to the Americas and to these other places, and they're exchanging culture, they're exchanging beliefs and exchanging knowledge with the Native Americans, with the Africans, and they're creating new societies. Europeans are establishing trading posts, and so African goods and culture and Native American goods and culture are flowing back to Europe and acting on Europe. European culture is flowing across and acting on them. Remember, a consequence of all this is that Native Americans are going to be wiped out in large numbers. Okay? Expansion of overseas territorial claims and European immigration in North and South America. All right, so the Spanish have Mexico, Central America, South America, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. All right. The French have Canada, Midwestern America, Louisiana. The British have their British North American colonies along the eastern seaboard, and the Portuguese have Brazil. All right. Remember that the Aztec and Inca empires are conquered by Pizarro and Cortez. So Cortez can't conquer the Aztec. Pizarro, the Inca. This led to the destruction and demise of the culture and people of the Americas. They're going to keep their culture intact and there will be a resurgence of that culture later on, but the Spanish are really going to do their level best to wipe it out. All right. There's a rigid class system and dictatorial rule that emerges. So dictatorial rule is ruled by dictators in Latin America. So Latin America, by the way, is Mexico and South America. The Spanish oppressed the indigenous people. They created a hierarchy in which Spanish, Iberian, so peninsular Spanish were at the top. And then if you were Spanish, but you were born in the New World, you were upper class. And then all of the native people were at the bottom of the hierarchy. Spanish landholders were granted something called encomiendas. And encomiendas were grants by the Spanish king to enslave a certain number of the indigenous people. So they would be allowed to enslave a certain number of the locals to farm and ranch for them and mine for them. All right, and so slavery was practiced extensively. All right, the colonies imitated the culture of their parent countries. All right, so the people there tried to keep their Spanish cultural identities. They identified with their motherland. All right, they brought their culture and beliefs with them. All right, so colonization by small groups of merchants happened in India, the West Indies, and China. European nations established trade posts that had a smaller footprint in these areas than the New World. And we're going to find this in South and Southeast Asia as well. So trading companies become very common. Portuguese, after Vasco da Gama, built a trade empire in the Indian Ocean. They broke old Muslim and Italian domination on trade from the East, and they brought back goods at a fraction of the cost and made a killing. Their success attracted the attention of other European nations who were also going to try to establish trade companies. All right, and so you're going to get Dutch trade companies, right? The Dutch Republic is the Netherlands. The Netherlands declared independence from Spain in 1581 and became a leading sea power. They had the largest fleet of ships in the world in 1600, and they have the Dutch East India Company. And that is going to take control of trade in Asia. They're going to battle Britain to be the #1 trading company. All right? So you had the Dutch East India Company was the wealthiest and most powerful. Its trade headquarters was in Batavia, that's in Java. All right? And in 1700, the Dutch ruled much of Indonesia, which is in Southeast Asia, and had trade posts in many Asian countries, as well as the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. All right. By 1700, the English have a foothold, and they're going to establish the English East India Company, which is going to focus on establishing outposts in India, trade cloth with Europe. All right. And so Europeans established trading posts along the coast of Africa to trade in gold and later slaves. And they're going to bring manufactured materials to Africa to trade for gold and slaves and other resources. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that these trading companies were frequently in conflict with each other. So like the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company certainly fought each other for power and influence, and they even had entire armies. So the English East India Company had the army of the Indus, and the Dutch East India Company had its own mercenary army. It would almost be like if Walmart and Target had their own armies and fought with each other over turf and customers today, and you had like a McDonald's militia and a Wendy's army that slaughtered each other in competition for territory and customers. So anyway, it was definitely a interesting dynamic there. So Europeans established trading posts along the coast of Africa, like I said, trading gold, slaves, and other, they traded manufactured goods, finished goods, in exchange for gold, slaves, and other resources. Okay, so effects of European exploration. The discovery of the Americas by Europeans resulted, again, discovery Okay, you can't discover something that's already inhabited by somebody else, but it was new to them. So when they realized the Americas were there, it led to a furthering of that process I told you about, that globalization. So now those trade routes are going to stretch across the ocean, and new world goods are going to flow across the ocean to Europe, where they'll be transformed into finished goods. People and goods and culture will crisscross each other across the ocean, and we're going to see an exchange, a worldwide exchange of people, goods, and ideas. It's the beginning of this globalization process. It's the modern world is beginning to take shape in this time period, for better or for worse, because there are consequences, and we'll take a look at some of those. So, global transfer of foods, plants, and animals, people, culture, technology, products from the Western Hemisphere changed the life of Europeans. Things like corn, tobacco, and potatoes are going to have major ramifications. European horses are going to be taken to the New World. So when you think of the Midwest, or when you think of Plains Indians, you think of a Native American on horseback. Those horses were introduced by the Spanish and then bred. And then you have like wild horse populations out there, and Native Americans used the horse to hunt and in combat, and it became a part of that, but they weren't always there. Cows are going to change the life of Native Americans. And so when you think of Texas, you think of longhorn cattle. Well, longhorn cattle are cattle that have originated there with the Spanish and have been there since the Spanish came, and now cattle ranching is big out there, and down in Latin America, especially in like Argentina beef cattle supply a large portion of the world's beef introduced here by the Spanish. European diseases like smallpox, measles, mumps are going to wipe out millions of Native Americans. They had not been exposed. They did not have natural resistances built up over generations to these diseases. At times, this was intentional. Blankets taken from smallpox hospitals given to Native Americans with the intent of introducing the disease and wiping them out, leading many historians to refer to this as a genocide. All right, the Columbian Exchange, Americas to Europe, squash, pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, tobacco, pineapples, cocoa, beans, vanilla, all sorts of. These are just the products. Don't forget about the people and the ideas and the culture. All right, from Europe, Africa and Asia to the Americas, olives, turnips, all sorts of grain crops. Look, they're the same line, especially North America. Same lines of latitude. That means seasonal. That means growing season is going to be similar. That means you're going to be able to grow those high yield grain crops that were grown in Europe over here. And that's going to allow for a large, prosperous civilization. Those ever important domesticatable animals, cows, pigs, goats, sheep, horses. And don't forget about diseases like smallpox, typhus, and malaria. All right, and you can kind of see here's a contemporary sort of depiction of what's going on. You can see goods being offloaded. You can see things ready to go on. Here's goat, cow, pig, right? And certainly we could expect to see here Native Americans, and they're sort of reaching out to the ships as if to welcome them, which in some cases they did. But despite their hospitality, they quickly found themselves in conflict over these European arrivals for land and resources. Okay, so slavery in the Caribbean and America resulted from a shortage of labor to grow cash crops. Europe had an insatiable appetite for sugar, and sugar plantations popped up on a lot of those islands in the Caribbean very early on in the 1500s. And so to replace the Native Americans that they just wiped out, like the Arawak were completely wiped out in the Caribbean, they turned to African slaves. and slavery became based on race. It was against European custom to enslave another Christian. They thought nothing of enslaving people from Africa. And these plantation systems in the Caribbean destroyed the indigenous people and their economic systems, and then they replaced them with slavery. It's important to note that the type of chattel slavery that's practiced by Europeans in the New World is unique in history. At times you'll hear people talk about how slavery has been a constant in human history, and that it existed in Rome and in other ancient societies. This type of slavery is different. It's based exclusively on race. It is hereditary. And the people who are enslaved in the West African slave trade are not treated as humans. They take away their names and give them new names. They try to break their spirits. They use all sorts of torture and mutilation to try to break them down, and they are not considered humans. They're considered chattel or property. So this is a unique and especially cruel type of slavery that's practiced in the New World. All right. European nations established this trade pattern known as the triangle trade. So they've got, gold and silver from the Americas. They, got slaves from West Africa. They sent manufactured goods and rum to Africa and Asia. And so let's look at it. So you got sugar. Cash crops like sugar and tobacco come from Europe, or come from the New World to Europe. They can then manufacture things and sell them and trade them to Africa for slaves that are then sent to the Americas to produce more of these goods to send back. So this becomes a very lucrative sort of dynamic. And this right here is going to help drive the growth of the modern world. So slavery is going to help bankroll the Industrial Revolution in some ways. Certainly in what is going to be the United States, the economy, the nation itself is built on the backs of slaves. This leg right here of the triangle trade, in which slaves made the journey from West Africa. By the way, most African Americans today trace their ancestry to West Africa and the Guinea coast. That's the southward facing coast right here. For obvious geographic reasons, it's closer. This middle is called the Middle Passage. And this is a notoriously miserable journey made by these folks as they're taken from Africa to the New World. All right. African slaves are sold across the Atlantic to the Americas. It's not by choice. They were forced to migrate there. So the Atlantic slave trade is the buying and selling of Africans for work in the Americas. It went on from 1500 to 1600. There were 300,000 African Americans, nearly 1.3 million people in the by 1700. And even though the British outlawed the slave trade in the early 1800s, it continued illicitly, and eventually 9.5 million people were brought against their will to the New World. You can see that there's these split branches that they used, which they chained people's necks together, essentially, and they would march them to the coast like this. You can see there's a child here. That's another thing, something that is unique about chattel slavery is they destroyed family units, and so they thought nothing of selling a child away from the parent. That's especially true in British North America. Keep in mind that the people who end up becoming African Americans did not come straight from West Africa. Many of them came from the Caribbean, who were descended from people who came, straight from West Africa. You did have new Africans in British North America, but British planters preferred to buy their slaves from the Caribbean because those slaves were seasoned. Seasoning is the process of, quote unquote, breaking in the new slaves. So they would teach them the trade, teach them the language, and kind of acculturate them to their new life. And so British planters didn't want to do all that. They preferred slaves that had already been through that process, and so they would buy them from Caribbean slave owners. Most slaves that come to the New World are going to go to Latin America and the Caribbean. The largest group of them are going to go to Brazil. A few 100,000 come to British North America. And that population will eventually become self-sustaining and grow. And so by the time we get to 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, there are 4.5 million enslaved men, women, and children living in the United States. So this is just the beginning of a very tragic chapter in human history, and we'll talk about it some more. So Europeans that lived on sugar plantations and tobacco farms needed lots of labor. They wanted to get away from indentured servants because they were dangerous in British North America, because, and for a number of other reasons, slaves were becoming cheaper because the British had gained control of the slave trade. Native Americans were used. Remember the encomiendas, where especially like Spanish were granted encomiendas where they were allowed to enslave Native Americans. Well, the Native Americans were all dying. They died from disease, warfare, and just brutal treatment. So they had to look elsewhere. So Europeans in Brazil and the Caribbean and the southern colonies in North America looked to Africa for a number of reasons. Cost was low. All right. Europeans saw several advantages, so they were less expensive. Africans had been exposed to European diseases, so they had some immunity to those old world diseases. Many Africans had experience working with the crops that were being grown in the New World. Africans were less likely to escape because they were in a strange land, so they could not, it wasn't like the Native Americans where they knew their way around and could escape and blend in. Africans were also new to the New World, and that put them at a disadvantage. Their skin color also made it visibly easier to identify them. Slavery became exclusively based on race. That's unique in history. But it also made it a more comfortable arrangement for Europeans who had ideas about racial superiority that were definitely contingent on skin color. And so basically they viewed themselves as white and therefore superior, and they felt that because Africans were black, that they were inferior and therefore they could enslave them. And this becomes sort of the unjust sort of mantra that these slave owners use to validate the institution. African rulers did play a role in the slave trade. So African merchants at this time have become dependent on European products. The money is good, and so the Europeans are able to find African merchants who are willing to sell Africans to them in port cities. And I often hear people mistakenly use this as an excuse or as a defense against the institution of slavery, or as a misguided attempt to exonerate European slave traders and slaveholders. First of all, you're already on the wrong track if you're trying to make that argument. Like there's no defending this. But also, I've heard people say, well, they sold their own people. And that is completely untrue. And so in Africa, for centuries, like in other parts of the world, types of slavery were practiced. And usually slavery was a means of assimilation. So like if two peoples went to war, they would often, instead of killing the other opponent, they would try to capture them alive and enslave them for a period of time, thus assimilating them into their society. It often wasn't hereditary. It certainly wasn't based on race, and they had rights. They were allowed to own property. There were rules about how they could be treated. Not that it was good, but it was not the same as the type of slavery that Europeans practiced in the New World. And also, to say that they were selling their own people is to suggest that all Africans viewed themselves as one people. And that just isn't true. Like, you would not say, like, you know, the English and the French were at war with each other. You would not say that they were killing their own people, right? The English and the French are both white Europeans, but they look at themselves as English or French. They look at themselves as distinct and different and enemies. Africans were the same way. There were different cultures and societies. They recognized different ethnicities and even races inside of Africa. And so to say that they all were one people is a misguided opinion. The role of African merchants can't be disputed, but this is certainly not a way to defend or sort of exonerate Europeans in their role in New World slavery. All right, so big impact on Africa and the Americas due to slavery. Africa is going to lose generations of some of their best members. African families are going to be torn apart, and the introduction of guns to the continent is going to result in warfare that is eventually going to be used as an excuse by European powers to take control of Africa, which they will, and we'll talk about later, the Berlin Conference, where the Europeans are basically going to carve Africa up and divide it amongst themselves without the consent of the Africans. The effect on America is going to be profound. New World empires are going to be built on the backs of slaves. And I'll use America and later the United States as an example. So the swamps were drained, the roads were built, the forests were cleared by slave labor. The cities were built by slaves. If you look at Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institute was built by slaves. The White House was built by slaves. The statue that sits atop the Capitol building as I record this video was cast by slaves. By the time we get to 1860, something like 60% of the U.S. GDP, of U.S. exports rather, are from cotton that is harvested by slave labor. So most of the money that the U.S. is making is through slave labor. And so the modern world, the modern Atlantic world, is built on the backs of slaves. Many colonies wouldn't have survived or wouldn't have flourished the way they did. And so the role of slavery in all of this is prominent and indisputable, and it's an ugly thing. The slaves that were brought here from West Africa, the Europeans tried to dehumanize them. They tried to take away their African names and give them European names. They tried to force them to abandon their languages, and they weren't successful. So Africans retained their culture. Not only did they retain blank. All right, that's my son, and now he's going to go so that I can continue to do this. Okay, sorry for that interruption. So anyway, they're not going to be able to suppress African culture. The African people brought here are going to pass their culture and their traditions down generation to generation. They're going to keep it intact. And not only are they going to do that, but they're going to share their culture and their traditions with Europeans. And so Europeans are going to start to adopt African music, African art. Aspects of African religion are going to influence European religion and change the way Europeans worship God. The food, certainly, that Europeans eat is going to be completely transformed by Africans. And I put one example here because this is one that you and I can easily relate to. This is a banza, which is a West African instrument that you and I are more familiar with as the banjo. And so the banjo is a West African instrument that becomes a key part of African slave spirituals that will later be a key component of blues music. And blues and the Chicago Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance are really the roots of all modern music. So like all the modern genres, whether it's country music, I mean, come on, it's a banjo, or hip hop or rock and roll, they trace their roots back to those spirituals sung by slaves with the drums and banjos and things like that. So tremendous influence that this group of people who are imprisoned in the institution of slavery are still going to act on their captors in very profound ways. So it's a major exchange of culture that's taking place here. Interesting stuff. Lots of precious metals flowing from the New World to Europe, gold and silver. The Spanish are going to have the largest silver mine in the world, Potosi. All right. The indigenous empires of the Americas are going to be disrupted and destroyed. Europeans are going to take the wealth for themselves. We talked a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about the term mercantilism. I think I've mentioned it already in a previous lecture. Spain is going to become extremely wealthy. So Spain's going to gain a lot of wealth, but that wealth is going to ultimately backfire on them, and essentially they're going to overextend themselves. And by overextending themselves and not focusing enough on domestic affairs, they're eventually going to sort of self-destruct. And so by the time we get to the 19th century, Spain is just going to be a shadow of its former self and really cease to be the global power that it was, even earlier than that. This is a lot of Equiano. And we're not sure if his account is his individual experience, or if he maybe interviewed somebody and told their tale through his perspective. And there's different opinions out there. But his writings are probably the best account we have of what it was like to be an enslaved person on the Middle Passage. And so he writes and tells us the story from capture to imprisonment on the slave ship and the raw horror of the imprisonment on the slave ship, to landing and sail in the West Indies and life as a slave. So he gives us a really detailed glimpse. And his book was one of the first published by a person that had endured this. And this is just a quote. He's talking about seeing the slave ship from the African coast for the first time. He says, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon connected with terror. When I was carried on board, I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me." There were many of these folks had no idea what their fate was. Some believed that they were going to be eaten by the Europeans. Many certainly thought they were going to die. Suicide aboard slave ships was so common. People would just leap into the sea and kill themselves rather than be on the ship. It was so common that slavers would actually put nets around the deck of the ship so that the captives couldn't throw themselves into the ocean and commit suicide. That's how terrible it was. And you can kind of see, so here's people being brought out to the coast. Again, this is pretty much standard. This is a kind of a branch that's wide on either end, and then they would have like a chain lock behind the neck. And they would have entire processions of these folks, and they would march them out in long lines. And you can see that children, women are not excluded from this. When they got to the coast, they were separated. So usually what they would try to do is they would try to put you, if you were, let's say you were Igbo, they would put you with Mende. So they would try to put people together who did not speak the same language, because by doing that, they could make it harder for them to plan a rebellion or an escape. They would separate men from women. They would separate children from the rest of the group. And you can imagine how horrifying that would be. Like, look at this as a baby. So the baby would probably be allowed to stay with the mother, but certainly this young child would be separated, terrified, scared for its life. They would force feed these folks alcohol to kind of keep them in a stupor so that they wouldn't fight or try to escape. They would also brand them, well, like cattle, which again, this is a different institution. The Europeans are branding these folks with hot irons and cages on the coast. This is a mercantile approach to humanity that the world quite hasn't seen until this point. Here's the Middle Passage. They're coming from West Africa. They're coming from the Guinea coast. All right, some from sub-Saharan Africa, but most from the West Africa and the Guinea coast. Many are headed to Brazil. Many are headed to Latin America and the Caribbean. All right, and then from the West Indies, from a lot of these sugar islands, they're heading toward the southern and middle colonies in the U.S. All right, this is one of the most famous drawings of a slave ship we had available. All right, and you can see where, so like they're built in decks, and really you could call them shelves. So like this is one shelf, and all the people are laid on their backs, side by side, and slave ship owners, we call them slavers, called this tight packing. There's two different ways you could do this. You could put the people in there in a loose configuration, and by doing that, you might have more survive the journey. But they found out that they could make more money by packing as many people into the ship as possible, because even though more would die, they would make it with more when they got to the West Indies. And so it was about money. And in these early journeys, as many as a third to a half of these folks died. It was a miserable existence. Mutinies aboard these ships were really common too, and so if you ask the average slaver captain, it was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when the slaves aboard the ship staged an uprising. They weren't chained down the entire time. The crew would bring them up to the deck often to exercise them. And these were moments of opportunity that these folks took. Even though they didn't speak the same language, they learned each other's language on the voyage very quickly, and then would stage uprisings. And we have the only ones we know of are the ones where they actually managed to take over the ship. Like the Amistad is a very famous ship where the slaves successfully mutinied, seized control, and it ended up in New England. But many more just disappeared because once the crew was dead, the Africans unfamiliar with seafaring could not pilot the ship home. Note that the men and women are separated, children are separated. The Middle Passage is especially treacherous for women who were seen as fair game for the European crews, and certainly rape was excessively common. All right, and then you can see, like I said, in this particular picture, they are throwing slaves overboard. And you might say, okay, well, why are they doing that? It's because they don't have enough provisions to feed them all. And so their solution is just to kill the folks that they can't feed. And what they would do is they would go through and pick the people who were the least valuable. So they would say, okay, well, this person is weak or infirm or sick or injured in some way. And so those are the folks that they would throw into the ocean. And that was because that was if they ran short on provisions. So they couldn't feed everybody. So like I said, it's just this mercantile approach to death, this cheapening of human life to such a degree of cruelty that it had not existed in human history prior to New World chattel slavery. This concludes our SOL 4 Age of Exploration lecture. Make sure you guys do the guided notes, answer the chapter questions, and make sure you do the discussion board. Then I'll see you next time.